Hello, everybody, to this, the first Tile Network meeting in 2025. And I have the pleasure to host this Tile meeting today with the LGBTQ plus Psych Neuro Network and Alexia. My name is Carolina, and I'm the host of Tile, but given it's February, we have joined forces with Alexia. Alexia, do you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Yeah, hi, I'm Alexia Revueltas, and I'm the lead of the LGBT Psych Neuro Network for the School of Psychology and Neuroscience.
So today we have our speaker, Maxime Levasseur, with us. She is a BSc alumna and visiting researcher at Newcastle University, where she contributes to a range of research projects within the School of Psychology. And she also works clinically as an assistant psychologist in the NHS. Today, her talk is on a very clever title, is on questioning the sex education system, LGBTQIA plus sex education, and the safety of first consensual sexual encounter. Without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Maxime. Hello and welcome.
Hello, thank you very much. I wish I could take credit for the title, but that is my colleague's creation. So thank you, Dan, for that one. If you just bear with me, I will share my screen. Can everybody see that all right there?
Yes.
Okay, lovely. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the lovely intro. And thank you all for attending this seminar that I'm very excited to be in collaboration with the Tile Network and the LGBTQ plus Psych Neuro Network. As was just said, my name is Maxime Levasseur. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a visiting researcher and alumna at Newcastle University. I'm also currently working clinically in the NHS as an assistant psychologist, specifically with people with acquired brain injuries. Today, I'm going to be taking you through a study that I've had the pleasure of co-leading with my Newcastle University colleagues, Daniel Smith and Dr. Billy Moffat-Knox, for which we are currently writing a manuscript with the hopes of publication in the near future. The manuscript's working title, which, as I said, I can unfortunately not take credit for, but also the title of today's presentation is Questioning the Sex Education System, LGBTQIA plus Sex Education, and the Safety of First Consensual Sexual Encounters. Now, before I start fully, my slides aren't working. There we go. Before I start this presentation, I just wanted to do a brief disclaimer. So whilst I have co-led this research project for a number of years and have dedicated a lot of time to this area through various roles in the field of sexual health, this is not my PhD. I am a recent graduate with a psychology bachelor's degree and a level of specialist experience, and I undertook this project as extracurricular research in conjunction with Dr. Billy, who is chair of the Rainbow Network at Newcastle University, and Dan, whose research focuses on experiences within the LGBTQIA plus community. But with all of this context, I am still just a person. Specifically, I am a white, non-British born cis woman. And whilst I do make a conscious effort to be as objective and inclusive as possible in both my research and in my life, what I will talk about today may be influenced by my own experiences and background. I am always actively wanting to learn, so please do let me know if there is any language that I can improve upon, but I will aim to be as inclusive as possible with the language that I use and the content that I am presenting today. So speaking of language, I wanted to first define some terms which I will be using throughout the presentation today, starting off with LGBTQ+. So this is an acronym commonly used to describe people who are lesbian, gay, bi, trans, queer, questioning, and ace. Other commonly used acronyms according to Stonewall include LGBT, LGBTQ, and LGBTI. Today you'll hear me refer to LGBTQIA+ as an acronym, but when I'm referring to other people's research, I will aim to use their own terms of reference for their own sample, so you may also hear me refer to LGBT today as well. Another definition I wanted to go through is gender. So according to Brooke, gender is defined as how a person sees or feels about themselves. This also refers to ideas about human behavior, actions, and roles in relation to masculinity and femininity. Different genders might include woman, man, non-binary, and more. Another definition here to differentiate is sex. So this is our biological sexual characteristics, which may include the external genitals, internal reproductive organs, chromosomes, and hormones. And importantly here, sex doesn't always neatly fit into male and female categories and can also include being intersex as well. We've also got sexuality. This is someone's sexual behaviors, attractions, likes, dislikes, and preferences. Sexual orientation, which is how a person feels sexually about people of various genders, also makes up a part of someone's sexuality. Some further definitions here are cis-normativity. So this is the assumption that man and woman are the default genders, and trans and non-binary genders are different or other. And similarly here we've got heteronormativity. This is the assumption that heterosexuality is the default sexual orientation and all non-heterosexual sexualities are again different or other. So today I'll be using the term cis-heteronormativity, which indicates a combination of these two definitions on the screen now. Okay, so I'd like to now give an overview of the background to the current piece of research that I'll be discussing today. So in 2019, the Department for Education published statutory guidance on relationships education, relationships and sex education, which we'll be referring to as RSE going forward, and also health education for schools. This was later revised in 2021, and the document outlines guidance for relationships education in primary schools and RSE in secondary schools. Now, the document does touch upon specific guidance for LGBT topics, stating that, quote, schools must ensure that they comply with the relevant provision of the Equality Act 2010, under which sexual orientation and gender reassignment are amongst the protected characteristics. And whilst the guidance states that schools should ensure that this content is fully integrated and that it is expected that all pupils should have been taught LGBT content by the end of secondary school, one section of the document states that LGBT RSE should be delivered, again, quote, at the point at which schools consider it appropriate to teach their pupils about LGBT. This introduces the possibility of subjective biases against the appropriateness of LGBT-specific sex education and can leave schools to incorporate this content as a last-minute add-on if pupils are deemed not ready. This already highlights a possibility for cis-heteronormativity to affect the quality of RSE provided to LGBT students. Another important factor to consider here is that whilst the Department for Education has provided this documentation as statutory guidance, it is not legally mandatory for schools to adopt this within their curriculum. So, since the document's publication, a study by Comper et al. Has highlighted the strengths and weaknesses of the statutory guidance in schools, listing a number of benefits and weaknesses. For instance, this paper named positives such as RSE being taken more seriously, having greater clarity and structure, having fresh opportunities to discuss issues, and having increased opportunities for classroom discussion of LGBTQ+ relationships. However, they also named certain teacher challenges, including timing constraints, consistency of RSE between teachers, and appropriate training. Parental concern was also raised as a concern in another study. Similarly, further background research has shown that the evidence surrounding the importance of receiving RSE during adolescence is mixed. For instance, one study found that receiving sex education in school before first sexual intercourse was associated with fewer risky sexual behaviours. Another study found that sex education from mothers to their daughters, i.e. discussing sexuality and safe sex, was a significant predictor of whether the daughters would have a safe sex talk with partners about condom use. And yet another study found that adolescents with higher HIV and AIDS preventative self-efficacy reported less overall risky sexual behaviours. However, one study of semi-structured interviews revealed a theme of disconnect between sex education and real-life sexual experiences. And the diverse range of responses in the study demonstrated that the relationship between sex education and safer sex also depended on the individual, although there was some evidence that it, quote, did help. Another study found that adolescents with more sexual knowledge did not show increased practices in reports of safe sex behaviour, and even found that adolescents with more sexual knowledge were in fact less positive in their sexual attitudes. So I hope this slide kind of summarises and highlights the extent of the mixed results about RSE in previous literature. In terms of LGBTQIA+ sex education specifically, certain studies have explored individuals' attitudes towards and perceptions of RSE in an LGBT sample. For instance, one study found that LGBT youth perceived current sex education as exclusive, and that a direct discussion of LGBT issues would create a more inclusive experience. A review paper also found that content of sex education was almost exclusively heteronormative and exclusive to genders and sexual minority youth. Sex education was also described in a recent study as cis-normative as well as heteronormative, with transgender students reporting that their sex education left them with insufficient applied sexual health knowledge, delayed understanding of their identity, and feelings of being unprepared for sexual encounters, amongst others as well. This context is also important to consider in tandem with the exclusion of LGBT samples rooted in previous sex education research. For instance, one study's sample consisted of only heterosexual university students and measured safety through condom use. And even in studies without sexual minority exclusion criteria, the majority of one study's sample still identified as heterosexual. And despite this, a recent systematic literature review found substantial evidence of supporting LGBTQ inclusive education across the school curriculum and a healthy approach to healthy sexuality. Another study found that greater perceived inclusivity in sex education was associated with lower anxiety, depression, and suicidality in a sample of sexual minorities. So, our study aimed to explore sex education and its impacts on safety of first sexual encounter beyond cis-heteronormative relations and contexts by using an entirely LGBTQIA+ sample. Particularly, our study aimed to explore school-based sex education and risky sexual behaviours in first consensual sexual encounters in an aim to rectify previous inequities of LGBT participation in sex education research. So, I'll now be taking you through our research methods for this study. So we designed a correlational survey-based study to explore school-based sex education in hours and safety of first sexual encounter, for which we used an adapted version of the Safe Sex Behaviour Questionnaire, which we'll be referring to as the SSBQ going forward. So we did adapt the SSBQ, which is a measure used in multiple previous studies mentioned previously in the background section, to remove certain items that implied homophobic attitudes. So this included item 8, which is, quote, I ask my potential sexual partners about a history of bisexual and homosexual practices, which the research team considered to be a possible implication that having bisexual and gay encounters would be more risky than heterosexual encounters. Therefore, we used our modified version of the SSBQ in this study, and we also split the SSBQ into part 1, which had only yes or no response options, and part 2, which included yes, no, and not applicable response options to be more inclusive there. So overall, our questionnaire collected mixed methods data, which looked at hours of sex education in school, factors surrounding sex education, and both age and safety of first consensual sexual encounter. Our sample inclusion criteria were being over 18 years old and identifying as LGBTQIA+. And our study was, of course, approved by the Newcastle University School of Psychology Research Ethics Committee. So in terms of the participants, we received responses from 96 consenting and eligible participants whose ages ranged from 18 to 53 years old. Of this sample, 27 participants were cisgender men. 47 were cisgender women. I've just put that the wrong way around, sorry. 4 were transgender men, 1 was transgender woman, 10 were non-binary, and 7 preferred to self-describe. We also collected some sexual orientation data there as well. The study was completed online via Qualtrics and included demographic questions such as questions about their sexuality and questions about their school-based sex education, the safety of their first consensual sexual encounter, and the 21 chosen SSBQ items. Optional open qualitative questions were also provided at the end of the main study block, and we also offered participants the chance to receive the study results in the future via a link to a separate survey to maintain their confidentiality as well. So, what did we find? We found quite a few things, so I've split this section into quantitative and qualitative results to best summarize the findings here. In terms of quantitative, so the age of participants' first school-based session of any form of RSE ranged from 7 to 18 years old. We did also differentiate and ask participants for their first school-based sex-specific RSE session, which ranged from 9 to 18 years old, with an average of 11.37 for the first one there and 12.97 for the second. As you can see, the mean age was higher for the sex-specific RSE compared to the general RSE. We also found participants' total hours of sex education before first sexual encounter ranged from just 1 to 40, with the mean hours of school-based sex education being 8.05 hours. And we also looked at the mean hours of LGBTQIA+ or non-heteronormative sex education being only 2.7 hours. And notably, only 10 participants stated having had any LGBTQIA+ sex education here. Then participants' average age of first consensual sexual encounter was 17.28 years, and looking at participants' average scores on our modified SSBQ, the mean safety rating of participants' first sexual encounter was 1.45. And just to clarify that number there, 1 is the most unsafe and 2 is the safest, so 1.45, that kind of contextualizes that. We also completed some correlational analyses of the quantitative data and found the following results. So there was one significant quantitative result showing a small positive correlation between the age of first sexual encounter and the safety of first sexual encounter, and we've mapped that onto a graph there. So as you can see, as the age of the first sexual encounter increases, the safety of the first sexual encounter also increases there. We also found a number of quantitative results which were unfortunately not significant, but still interesting. So there was a very small positive correlation between hours of sex education received before first encounter and safety of first encounter. However, again, to repeat, this was not significant. There was also a very small positive correlation between hours of LGBT specific sex education and safety of first encounter, but again, this was not significant. And the last one there was a very small positive relationship between age of first session of sex education and age of first sexual encounter. But again, these were not significant correlations here. So whilst initially these results seemed to go against our predictions that there would be a correlation between hours of sex education and safety of first encounter, participants' qualitative responses really highlighted important contextual factors to our findings here, and I'll go through those now. So the study's qualitative data highlighted key factors affecting the participants' sex education experiences, and we used thematic analysis to summarize into 5 consistent themes, which were coded as follows. So societal expectations we defined as standards and values founded by society, which influence the individual in their sexual education, desires, and preferences. Insufficient education we defined as any limiting factor or incorrect promotion which inhibits the quality and diversity of the individual's sexual education. Religious and political impact we separated into religious impact, which we defined as values and beliefs with religious origin used by people or institutions which exclude, inhibit, or demonize aspects of sex education. And then political impact, which we kind of linked together there. We defined that part as laws and policies enacted by the government which affected the quality of sex education received. Then another theme was source of education, which we defined as the origin of which an individual receives significant sexual education. And finally, positive experiences, which we defined as including detailed education and inclusive and diverse topics to ensure an involved education is received. So I'll go a bit more in depth into some of those now and give some quotes to highlight what we found. So firstly, one factor that was prevalent in multiple participants' qualitative responses was their experience of stigma surrounding sex and any sexuality that was not heterosexuality. Many participants noted that during their RSE sessions, teaching focused primarily on STIs, abstinence, and shame surrounding sex and sexuality. So one quote that illustrates this is, "The only thing I was slightly educated about was STI risk from cis male to cis male sex. There was no LGBTQIA plus education at all." Apologies. Another participant here reflected on biased attitudes from their education, stating that my teacher said openly that she thought that everyone was entitled to have sex with whoever they wanted, but that she personally thinks it's disgusting, referring to gay sex. So this really highlights the impact of societal expectations of cis-heteronormative attitudes as a barrier of adequate sex education. This can in turn have important implications for LGBT individuals who may engage in sexual encounters without having received the appropriate knowledge to maximize their own safety. Then we have insufficient education, which was another key barrier for many participants, with responses indicating that many individuals did not receive sufficient quality of RSE to equip them with the knowledge and tools to engage in safe sexual encounters, especially in LGBTQIA+ contexts. So, for example, one participant stated, "For man-woman relationships, it was fine and covered the basics. No great detail about STIs apart from they're bad and to use a male or female condom. No other forms of contraception mentioned. No talk about LGBT sex. Not a lot on consent apart from to make sure it's there. Nothing about physical signs of STIs, e.g. sores, etc." And then another participant here highlighted the lack of LGBTQIA+ specific sex education, noting that the sex education I received was fairly poor quality. It was touched on in year 6, but then stopped until roughly year 8, but it wasn't LGBTQ+ inclusive and only dealt with cisgender/heterosexual topics. And then a further quote highlighted further gaps in sex education knowledge here. It only covered the contraception we could use, barely how to use them and what their pros and cons are. It was an all-girls school, so I have no idea if the boys' school was taught the same things. It didn't make me feel informed and comfortable about the idea of having sex. So these quotes again highlight the participants' prevalent experience of insufficient education, unfortunately, which could again have implications for their own sexual behaviours and risky sexual encounters in the future. The next theme was religious and political impacts. So there has been frequent debate considering what should be included in sexual education, with section 28, for example, stating that local authorities in England, Scotland and Wales should, quote, shall not intentionally promote homosexuality or publish material with the intention of promoting homosexuality. So that's obviously a political impact there. And then we've got certain religious beliefs also denouncing any non-heterosexual behaviour as sinful. So this highlights both of these factors as possible barriers to inclusive sex education for participants. So we did also see that in the quotes. So one participant reflected on the impacts of politics on RSE and noted, I was a teenager when section 28 was introduced. Schools were not allowed to teach about same-sex relationships then. Another mentioned religious impacts, saying, I was in a Catholic school up until year 8. There was absolutely no talk of contraceptives, STIs, and especially LGBTQ plus sex ed. Only info we got was during biology class. And similarly, another participant noted here, in Catholic school, there was no sex ed at all. And because of the religion of condoms were mentioned, we were heavily influenced not to use them. We got shown video of an abortion as a reason to not have abortions, but no talk of contraceptives. So these factors, sorry, I skipped ahead there, but these factors seem to have an impact on the RSE knowledge that is gained by participants and the associated biases with this as well, coming from that political and religious impact there. Another key theme was the source of RSE, which was seen as another important factor. So one participant stated that school was not very helpful, either my mother or father were helpful. My friend's parents spoke to us both about safe sex when we were 16, but again, they were referring to straight sex. Nothing was mentioned about LGBTQ+. Media was also highlighted as a source of education, with one quote saying, media, especially as sex is portrayed as something amazing and passionate when it's actually kind of awkward and messy, and foreplay wasn't really included in a lot of media. And self-directed education was also noted by one participant saying, I also read a lot of magazines aimed at teenagers which would have features about sexual experiences. So therefore, as demonstrated with the previous qualitative themes, because of the many factors impacting the education received from school settings, seeking alternative sources of RSE in this way is understandably shown to be important for certain participants. It wasn't all doom and gloom though, so we did find a theme of positive experiences where certain participants reported having positive RSE experience with detailed education and inclusive and diverse topics discussed. So we have one chunky quote here, which I will read through. So one participant reported RSE being quite good, fairly comprehensive education at secondary school, year 9 in particular, with a moderate amount of LGBT focused advice. Sorry, that was 2 quotes there. And another highlighting the best sex education lesson I was ever given was by a substitute teacher, and she had this fake penis with a tube up the middle to simulate semen, although this feature wasn't used. And she showed us how to safely roll on a condom, making sure we knew how to pinch the tip and which side was the outside. We were then invited to come up and try, or to go by her office during lunch if we wanted to try without the pressure of the whole class watching. It felt very controversial at the time, and there was a strange air of judgment for anyone who did put the condom on and got it right first time, but it was a wonderful lesson, and I can still remember it clearly now, like 13 plus years later. Very grateful for that day. So I hope these quotes demonstrate the practical and comprehensive approaches to RSE can be effective in ensuring good knowledge intake and future impact. So that was the qualitative responses. So overall, these responses revealed numerous barriers in LGBTQIA plus sex education provision, which included societal expectations, insufficient education, religious and political impacts, and source of education. However, the qualitative data also highlighted certain positive experiences for LGBTQIA plus participants with beneficial impacts there. Okay, so I'm aware that was a lot of findings to throw at you, so I've provided a brief summary of the research as well before I jump into the implications and future directions. So Overall, our research explored experiences of sex education and safety of first sexual encounter in a sample of 96 participants who identified as LGBTQI+. We use an online questionnaire with a modified scale to collect mixed methods data. The quantitative findings were limited and only showed one small significant correlation between age of first consensual sexual encounter and safety of first consensual sexual encounter. And our qualitative findings, on the other hand, revealed 5 key themes that affected participants' sex education experiences. And these were societal expectations, insufficient education, religious and political impact, source of education, and positive experiences. But what does this all mean? So first, let's look at the quantitative results. So this data did not reveal what we had predicted it would. However, considering the factors that there was limited amount of RSE in our sample overall, including only 10 people who had ever received any LGBTQIA+ specific RSE, it was unlikely that we were going to reveal a lovely, neat, positive correlation between hours of education and sexual safety. The correlation that we did find to be significant between age at first sexual encounter and safety of first sexual encounter could, however, still imply that participants gained more sexual knowledge over time as they became older, even though this might not have been through their schooling, which also links to one of the qualitative themes, source of education, which revealed that media and people outside of schooling were in fact helpful in contributing to participants' sex education. However, one previous study, which I've just cited at the bottom there, found that peer leaders as opposed to adults were actually less effective in imparting information about sex education. So this study raises a key point regarding the importance of delivery style of RSE. Another example of this is one qualitative study finding that trust and confidentiality and credibility were important principles for youth-centered sexuality education. A further study of senior school students found that their criteria for effective sexuality education included aspects of classroom structure, curriculum content, and teacher competency. Therefore, it is vital for educators and teachers to actually consider these important factors for RSE content, and competency is important beyond just knowing the facts, for instance, by accounting for personal biases and teacher attitudes there as well. So that point links nicely onto another key theme in the qualitative findings, which was societal expectations. So this also links to some of the studies which we discussed in the beginning of the presentation, which I'm just going to remind you of here. So one review paper found that content of sex education was almost exclusively heteronormative and exclusive to gender and sexual minority youth. Sex education was also described in another study as cis-normative and heteronormative, with transgender students reporting that their sex education left them with insufficient applied sexual health knowledge, delayed understanding of their identity, and feelings of being unprepared for sexual encounters. Amongst others as well there. This also links to the theme of insufficient education, with another study finding that LGBT youth perceived current sex education as exclusive, and that direct discussion of LGBT issues would create a more inclusive experience. So these studies particularly highlight the importance of creating an inclusive environment for all students so that they can feel recognised and included in RSE sessions and gain knowledge that is relevant to them. Reinforcing the importance of this, the theme of positive experiences also truly hits home how vital inclusive RSE experiences can be, as they can have a lasting impact on people's lives. One quote that sticks with me in particular is the participant stating that it was a wonderful lesson, and I can still remember it clearly now, like 13 plus years later. Very grateful for that day. So I really like that quote there. So what were the practical outcomes of this research? Well, got to make a joke here. Would we truly be researchers if one study didn't give us further research questions for another. So one outcome of this study was obviously the development of a further research project which aims to explore the impact of delivering more inclusive sex education, specifically whether this would improve LGBTQIA+ participants' self-efficacy around safe sex. So this additional study involved creating an inclusive sex education intervention, which you can see a sample of on screen now, and comparing participants' self-efficacy around sexual safety both pre and post this intervention. Whilst we don't currently have the results for this study, data collection has now concluded with a pilot of 10 people and 100 responses overall. So further variables that we explored in this additional study also looked at religiosity and religious upbringing, amongst others, as possible moderators and mediators, which again aims to answer some of the questions raised by the current study's themes, for example, religious and political impact. So, this study's findings have highlighted the need for LGBTQIA+ inclusive RSE and the impact that exclusive RSE can have on individuals from sexual minority groups. But how can we make these findings and implications tangible, and how can we implement them in teaching, innovation, and learning enhancement? So, in a sex education and RSE context, simple changes such as using gender-neutral language can foster a more inclusive environment. For example, asking about someone's partner instead of using heteronormative language and assuming that someone is in a heterosexual relationship. Another suggestion that I've put here is having definitions of sex and sexual encounters that go beyond the cis-heteronormative idea of sex being limited to penis and vagina or PIV intercourse. Another suggestion that I've included here is including LGBTQIA+ couples in our examples of healthy relationships is also really important as well. So I just want to also mention that none of these suggestions are about removing words from our vocabulary. It's rather the opposite. It's about giving everyone the opportunity to feel included in this conversation, which does affect everybody. So by modeling this inclusive behavior in teaching, we can not only impact individuals in that classroom at that time who may feel more seen and included in RSE, but also foster a wider dispelling of cis-heteronormative biases and societal expectations. Because at the end of the day, sex education and sex-related research have historically excluded different minorities, and that is to the detriment of everybody. In fact, we do all share the need for an inclusive RSE curriculum regardless of our own identity. Because even if you don't think LGBTQIA+ sex education affects you directly, as a member of society and possibly an eventual parent, manager, company director, colleague, friend, it is all of our responsibility to know how these issues can have an impact and how we can contribute to breaking down these barriers. So, if there is one thing that I hope you take from this presentation, it would be to practice being more inclusive, not just in RSE, but beyond. Use neutral language when, for example, someone tells you that they've gotten married, and once you know their pronouns and their partner's pronouns, you can start using them going forward. It's just that one small change that can make a big difference. And I suppose that is the big message from this presentation, that exclusive sex education can have long-term widespread impacts. So we should all aim to deliver inclusive education that everyone can feel represents them, so that everyone knows that they are part of the education they are receiving, regardless of being a sexual minority or not. And that's the message. We want to be educators for everyone. And in a world where sex remains a taboo subject for many, I truly hope that this research can contribute to breaking some barriers and stigma around RSE and LGBTQIA+ experiences. Thank you very much for your time and attention. And after rambling for quite a while, I will now welcome some questions that you may have there. I've also provided a list of references if anyone's interested as well. Thank you so much.
First of all, let me thank you for this absolutely fantastic talk. Thank you so much. It was so informative, and I learned so much. I have so many questions. So much. I'm going to stop the recording now. I just want to
Okay.
officially thank you. I'm going to stop it for our Q&A.